Good evening, I'm Peter Mez. Welcome to this evening's discussion, Smaller Government, Big Economy, ? Brought to you by Melbourne Conversations and Knowledge Melbourne, both initiatives of the City of Melbourne. The event is also supported by our long-standing venue partner, Federation Square, and by future leaders and its director, Dr. Helen Sykes. Tonight we're inquiring into the relationship between the government and the economy, between public sector finance and private sector activity, between deficits and growth. It's a timely conversation, not just because we're close to the end of the financial year, a time when we think about paying taxes and why we pay them, what they're for, but also because with the new financial year comes a new Senate, one the federal government hopes will be more amenable to passing some core budget measures that are currently stalled in the upper house. We've brought together a panel that combines economic expertise, analytical rigour, political experience, and a knowledge of the public, private and not-for-profit sectors. And our four panellists are all forthright people, so I'm anticipating a lively exchange of ideas. I'll introduce them to you shortly. As our conversation unfolds, I'll also be encouraging you to join in with your own comments and questions. Please keep them to the point, concise, so that as many people as possible can participate. So I'll invite our four speakers to come and join us up on the comfy chairs, and I'll introduce them to you as they come up on stage. The Honourable John Brumby is the former Premier and former Treasurer of Victoria, also a former federal MP, Joint Vice-Chancellor's Professorial Fellow at Melbourne and Monash Unis, and Chair of the soon-to-be disbanded COAG Reform Council. Economist Professor Judith Sloan is the Australian newspaper's contributing economics editor, a company director and an honorary professorial fellow at Melbourne University's Institute of Applied Economics and Social Research, and she was previously a productivity commissioner and a commissioner with the Australian Fair Pay Commission. Dr. Cassandra Goldie is the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Service, the peak body for the community services and welfare sector. A lawyer by training, she has extensive experience in public policy. And Dr. Tim Thornton is a political economist and lecturer in the Department of Education and Social Sciences at Swinburne University and has a particular interest in how we think about and talk about economics and how the discipline relates to the other social sciences. Please join me in making them welcome. Okay, the federal budget has been in the news ever since it was handed down. The government struggling to get a majority in the Senate. And this is despite the Treasurer's assertion that we're facing a fiscal emergency in Australia and that tough measures are immediately needed. Now, whether or not tackling the deficit is as urgent a task as Mr. Hockey suggests is contested, but there is, on the other hand, I think, broad agreement across the political spectrum that governments, both state and federal, need to address long-term structural problems in raising and spending revenue if we're to avoid indefinitely mounting budget deficits into the future. The argument, I think, is around how to do that. Do we tax more? Do we spend less? Is there some ideal mixture of the two? And underlying this question is also, I think, a question about how big government should be. I think it's fair to say the current coalition government wants to reduce the size of government, based on the view that if government gets out of the way, the private sector will step in and economic growth will take off. So let's start with this well-established idea that smaller government will deliver a bigger economy. It seems compellingly simple, a simple equation on the surface, but in fact it's more complicated, of course, because you have to ask, are we talking about the number of public servants employed? Are we talking about the amount of tax revenue as a proportion of GDP? Are we talking about the number of government enterprises? Are we talking about the amount of government regulation? These are all different factors and different ways of looking at it, not necessarily the same thing. So let me ask the question this way, and I'll start with Mr. Brumby, John Brumby. Does the evidence, as far as you see it, demonstrate that there is a clear link between the role and the size of government and the rate of growth in the economy?
Well, Peter, that's a very big question, so let me just start with a couple of general comments. I think if you look at government in Australia, you know, we have a federated system of government, more than 100 years of history, and I think the evidence suggests the Commonwealth, the 6 states, the 2 territories working together, that has been a great model for us. And if you compare Australia to the rest of the world in terms of our quality of life, the strength of our economy, even our unemployment rates, our clean air, our clean water, the livability of our cities like Melbourne, we compare exceptionally well. And I think history shows us too that governments working together, things like national competition policy, things like national disability insurance scheme, these things where states and Commonwealth work together are generally good for our economy and good in terms of building a fairer society. So if you look at the broad picture, I think we're doing pretty well. But we do have some big challenges, as you said, some structural challenges. So we've got an ageing population. We've certainly got congested cities, whether it's Melbourne, whether it's Sydney, whether it's Brisbane. And we've got a rate of spending in healthcare, for example, which, as the Grattan Institute has shown, is rising quite rapidly. And of course, we've got the regions around us competing, particularly China. And so in areas like education, though we're going pretty well, some of our competitors are doing better than us. So that's the general snapshot. When you look at the issue of the size of government in Australia, you can probably look at it in terms of public sector employees. And if you look at it in terms of public sector employees, we sit really in the lower proportion of developed countries around the world. And I think the latest figures I've got, which are from the ABS, 16.2% of total Australian jobs were in the public sector, and over the last decade, the ratio of public sector jobs to private sector jobs hasn't changed. It's about 5 to 1. The OECD, in their report, Value for Money in Government, Australia 2012, says, and I quote, Australia has a lower number of public sector employees at all levels of government combined than all other countries analysed. That is Austria, Canada, Denmark, Finland, France, Ireland, the Netherlands, New Zealand, Norway, Spain, Sweden and UK. So if you look at us in terms of public sector employees, we're certainly not large by any means. You can look at us in terms of spending, and the Grattan Institute, a very good independent body, say there is no good comparative evidence that Australian governments are too large. In fact, they are amongst the smallest in the OECD, with expenditure to GDP percentages lower than that of any other country except South Korea or Switzerland. And I guess the last point I'd make is the other way you can measure government is, so it's size of government employees, it's spending. The other way you can look at it is tax to GDP. And again, according to the OECD, their latest report in 2011, Australia's tax to GDP ratio was 26.5%. This was below the OECD average, and they say Australia's tax to GDP ratio has been below the OECD average since 2000, that is under successive governments, and it's typically ranked in the bottom third of countries since 1965, when comparable data was first available. So I'll just kick it off like that. I think our system of government is pretty good. Whether you measure it by employees, by spending or by tax, we tend to be down the lower end of that. And I think the real debate is about the effectiveness of the spending. And I hope we have time to discuss that a little bit later.
Well, you've already conceded the point, haven't you, John?
I'll come to you, Judith, in a sec, but certainly that we will come to the question of the effectiveness of government. But you could take what you've just told us there as evidence that, in fact, the thesis holds. Australia has a relatively low level of taxation, a relatively small government and a relatively successful economy. So, Judith Sloan, point proved for you?
Yes and no, but I mean, we shouldn't think that those figures are the only way of looking at it, actually.
I thought you might say that.
And the OECD is not actually the final word on this. For example, the tax ratio is only the Commonwealth tax ratio. It doesn't pick up state taxes. It doesn't pick up local government rates and the like. We think in terms of expenditure, it's probably about 40% of the economy. And there is quite an important issue here because in other developed countries, they run a social insurance arrangement, which is regarded as part of the government. We run a system of compulsory superannuation, which is not regarded as part of the government.
So this in terms of saving for retirement in other countries, it would be...
It's really basically the equivalent, but it's included as part of the government. whereas if we included our system of compulsory superannuation, that would add probably another 6 percentage points to the government share of the economy. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is the trends over time, because we kind of, you know, I know some of you are too young to remember Gough Whitlam, but, you know, he was a fan of a big and expansive government. But in fact, the share of the government in the Whitlam times was only about 30%. So over this period of time, it's gone up by 10 percentage points, which is an absolutely huge change. So I think it's probably right that we're in the lower half of size of government in terms of OECD countries. Thank the Lord, because a lot of those are just complete basket cases, and we wouldn't want to be like them, because they have unsustainable government debt, they have unsustainable social welfare programs, unsustainable promises going into the future, and ongoing deficits. So, you know, we don't really want to be comparing ourselves with basket cases. We want to be comparing ourselves actually with the South Koreas of this world, because that again is an extremely productive and high-growing economy, and it does that with a very small government sector.
Okay, thank you, Judith Sloan. Cassandra Goldie, what's your take on this issue of the size and role of government and the performance of the economy?
Well, I think, I mean, it's quite comforting that we seem to have some level of consensus that we're at least on the low end. And I've got to say, when in terms of size right now, and of course you would be forgiven for thinking that we've actually got a chronic problem of a massive blowout in terms of government with some of the public debate that has been prosecuted through, particularly through the Commission of Audit, which I think certainly took a very particular view about us needing to reduce further the role and size of government. And our view is that whether you look at it through the lens of wanting a stronger economy so that you create more jobs, or you look at it through the lens of better social outcomes, or importantly, in terms of how we do tackle our challenges on the environmental front, it's quite clear that if we are living in a modern society with the complexity that it has, the variation that it has across the community, you cannot just rely on the one hand on the market to deliver, and then on the other hand for the goodwill, for the charity. It's a very, I mean, we almost feel like I'm seriously going back into the sort of before, you know, sophisticated government began, with some of these messages around where the solutions might lie. If you talk to people who are involved in business, as we do, some of the big messages are skills gaps, big messages on educational outcomes. What are we doing about housing affordability and that big challenge? Their infrastructure is big as a challenge for us. Transport systems, now quite clearly, we need to have a really robust and effective system of government that has the complexity and capability of delivering on some of these quite complex pieces of work. We're talking about decent infrastructure build. Don't tell me we want government to just get out of the way. I mean, I'm involved in the G20 work, and corruption is a huge issue when you don't have the kind of right forms of regulation around government's role in ensuring that the common good and the public good is delivered out of these important pieces of work. So I think it's much less a useful discussion about some arbitrary size question and more about, you know, what do we need, and then what are the right combinations of roles and responsibilities depending on which area we're heading into. And obviously our big debate is the federated structure we have. No easy answer there, as John Brumby would know, but we're about to embark on that debate again, and so I think that's the big question. I'm very concerned. I've looked in the face of too many public servants lately who really are so under the hammer with, again, a massive reform agenda coming, and I'm not sure we're going to really struggle with the capability we need if we cut further.
Thank you, Cassandra Goldie. Tim Thornton, what's your take on this question?
Look, I don't know if there's a iron law between the size of government and economic growth. Certainly there's a diverse range of countries that have had large levels of government involvement in the economy. The countries that immediately come to mind would be kind of Sweden, China, the East Asian tiger economies. that makes it difficult to sort of... you could also find examples of rapid economic growth with very small levels of government involvement. I guess Hong Kong would be an example. Part of the problem in trying to find a fixed relationship is, as Peter's already suggested, there's different ways you can measure the size of government. Another important variable is the issue of quality of government intervention. It's not really so much just a matter of the quantity of government involvement as if there's some laundry list that is the ideal list of what government should or shouldn't be doing. So it's not always just a matter of what government does, but how well it does it. A large, capable government is likely to be more beneficial than a small, deeply corrupt or incompetent government. So it's just that variable of quality that's important. All that said, I think a major role for government is probably here to stay, regardless of what political parties in power. A modern economy, I think, is too complex and markets are too imperfect for anything else. I think increased use of markets will actually travel in tandem with increased regulation of those markets. And indeed, government involvement in the economy has a necessarily interdependent and complementary relationship with markets. One final thing I'd add on this issue of what determines growth is we shouldn't really just understand the whole equation in terms of a sterile dichotomy of sort of markets versus government. There are a lot of formal and informal institutions in the economy, like the overall issues of culture, that are quite significant variables in driving growth as well. So you've got to look at it a bit more broadly and in a richer fashion than to say there's a simple formula about the sort of the percentage level we should have of government in the economy.
Okay, thanks, Tim. Well, I think that Judith Sloan, I saw you shaking your head there. Now, the argument that's been put generally is it's not necessarily the size of government that matters, it's the quality of government. Is that something you agree with?
Well, okay, so they're basically... I do agree with that point in the sense that I'm not sure the figures get you that far, and it's not going to be very interesting for us to just debate the figures for the rest of time, but you've got to look at what the government is spending it on, and then how efficiently it does that, really. So, a small government person like me is all for defence, law and order and protection of property rights, And
that's it? I mean, what about education? What about research, those sorts of things?
Well, they may have a role in funding. They don't necessarily have a role in providing. And I'm very worried that if government is the answer, what is the question? I mean, haven't we been through massive periods of complete government incompetence and failure to deliver.
And we don't see that in the private sector?
Corruption in New South Wales, for example. I mean, if we think about infrastructure, and we think historically, a lot of infrastructure was built privately. And if we think of most of the mining-related infrastructure in Western Australia, for example, they got on and built that privately. It's absolutely incorrect to think it's all about government,
But Judith, nobody's saying that it's all about government. What we're saying is that with the kind of sophistication we should be able to expect, that we need to have the capability of the public service to make sure that we are getting what we need in terms of, transport systems, infrastructure build. We are not small little villages. We are growing in population size. We are part of a global economy. We need super smarts on this work, and we need super smarts from government, from the private sector and from the community organisations. Now, one of the most exciting pieces of work for us right now is fresh work we're doing over with this, some greater investment in infrastructure. How are we going to get really excellent outcomes in terms of job opportunities, particularly for people who are really struggling to get them, and how are we going to get the kind of benefits in terms of community impact as well as the thing itself? Now, If we just leave that to a totally market lens, we will not get that kind of benefit out of this investment. But if we have government at the table with community perspectives at the table and the private sector, and it has been done in places like Canada where you have a community benefit agreement that is worked up, the nuts and bolts are worked up around this new build to say, on every front, these are the measures we're going to work for. Now, the complex financing associated with that, the tax measures associated with that, all of that's got to be worked through. Now, we leave it to an open market environment only, we're not going to get that kind of great benefit that we should in terms of being a truly sophisticated, modern, forward-thinking economy and society.
John Brumby?
Well, I was just going to respond to a couple of the things. I think, in terms of Judith's comments about infrastructure, it is of course true that there's plenty of bits of infrastructure that have been built by the private sector. But if you look at the backbone of the infrastructure system in Australia, if you look at the airports, if you look at the railways, if you look at the energy generation system, if you look at the water supply system, all of those things were built, the public transport systems, all of them were built by government. And that's not to say that there's not a big role for the private sector in building infrastructure in the future. There is. But I think, to be fair, historically, the Snowy Mountain scheme, all of these things were public infrastructure and public investment, and they were long-term decisions by government that had a vision about the future of Australia. But I want to come back to the core point here today, because I think we started with this discussion about the size of government, and I think there was a consensus that, despite some differences and nuances and subtleties about how you might measure some of these things, that there's an agreement that Australia sits generally at the lower end of what our comparative nations do in terms of size of government. So for a relatively small size of government, historically, under successive governments, the question is, how have we gone as a nation? How have we delivered services? And I would say that we've done pretty well. In fact, I would say we've done very well. If you look at our health system, despite the challenges that it faces, most people would say we have one of the best, if not the best, health system in the world. As they would have said by the way of Victoria's, that it was the best in Australia. If you look at our education system, it ranks reasonably well, though not as well as it should be at the moment compared with our competitors, particularly in the Asian region. If you look at our cities and our transport system, I know we complain about them a lot, but they compare reasonably well with most places overseas. And if you then look at things like water supply and electricity supply and community safety and road safety, in all of these things, Australia performs pretty well. So it seems to me this debate at the moment, and you're getting onto it in the federal budget and the debate and the cuts and things, it seems to me that for a size of government which is not huge by any extent, which is quite modest, we do quite well. And so then you get into this debate, is the way forward to hack into more spending, as we saw in the federal budget, or is the way, or are there other issues that we need to talk about, including whether at a federal level and a state level, the states really have, and the Commonwealth government now really has, the revenue it needs to provide the services that the community expects in health and education, particularly with an ageing society. And so, and the other point I'd make is this, which I'm interested in Judith's response to. If one of the other tests of the effectiveness of governments have been trying to have been making reforms to what we broadly call the welfare system for the last 20 years, successive governments, and those reforms, by and large, have worked. And if you look at the Melbourne Institute data that was released last week, it shows that over the last 20 years, for the poorest people in our community, they're not more dependent on welfare, as you'd think from reading some of the daily media. In fact, they're less dependent. There are more people in the market getting jobs, supplementing their income. So the efforts that governments have made to lift the skills base, to get people back into the workforce, to help families in a time of need, to get them into jobs, these things have worked. So I don't see that the issue in terms of Australian governments, federal and state, is on the spending side. I don't think there's an issue there at all in terms of where we spend and how we spend and the effectiveness of our spending. And so you've got to say, whatever side of politics you're on, you've got to say there are big question marks about the size of the cuts that have been made and the cuts that have been transferred to the states. $80 billion worth of cuts. So I don't think the issue is on the spending side. The debate that we need to have as a nation is whether we need more revenue because post-GFC, the fact is that at a federal level and a state level, tax revenues simply haven't returned to the level that they were pre-GFC. So I don't think it's a spending issue, I think it's a tax issue.
Judith Sloan, I'll ask you to respond to that, but it is true, isn't it, that Australia's welfare system overall in international comparison is actually very well targeted, I mean, in comparison to many other countries.
It's quite well targeted. It could be better. And I mean, I think it's hyperbolic language to call what was happening in the budget hacking, because actually if you look at it, real government spending is continuing to increase by 2.5%. That's not a cut, that's an increase. But Cassandra, you must go along with a lot of the proposed changes because, you know, we shouldn't be giving money through Family Tax Benefit Part B to single income families. I mean, we really shouldn't have it at all. And I mean,
we agree. So obviously, this is one of the biggest areas of debate for the Australian community right now. What has been done in this federal budget, and I think what it's thrown up, and the reason we said at the time we think it is a very divisive budget, is because whichever area you're talking about, whether it's in the broadest terms, welfare, or in retirement incomes, or in health, we've got seriously two worlds. We are one of the most most targeted in terms of our welfare expenditure in the OECD.
And by targeted, we mean that it actually goes to people
we are chronic means testers. We do it incessantly, and so for people on the very lowest incomes, there has been no real increase in the unemployment payment for 2 decades. We cannot bring any government over the line to finally get some more reasonable level of adequacy into the unemployment payment. It's extraordinary. You know, $36 a day you're living on if you're unemployed. But you go into the areas where there is real serious growth on the expenditure side. They are in the health area and in the retirement income area. Now, and childcare, and the drivers of growth there are, on the one hand, where you've got, it is essentially a market environment with a rebate arrangement, and so the private health insurance rebate arrangement, which we believe is deeply inequitable because you only get access to, if you've got enough resources to buy your way into private health insurance, and then you get significant government support, but within a market context. Equally, as Judith's quite right in terms of the retirement income system, we don't have the social insurance model. We have this superannuation system. Now, obviously there are many good things about it, but the truth is it's not delivering what we need in terms of easing the pressure on the age pension. There are huge private sector interests now vested in the system as it stands, and that is one of the reasons why we've got both sides of major politics scared to death to touch reform in superannuation because it's so hard because of the powerful interests behind it.
Let's talk about a couple of areas where I think Cassandra Goldie and Judith Sloan might agree. That is that Family Tax Benefit Part B was too generous. That's being changed.
At the high end, absolutely.
At the high end, everyone agrees with that. What about the other one, Judith Sloan, that Cassandra Goldie's just mentioned? That is the tax treatment of superannuation, which is incredibly generous. It's very beneficial if you're a high-income earner to put your money into superannuation and get it taxed at a lower rate. That's something that we could change, isn't it?
Well, it's just a myth, what you're saying, which is perpetrated by, you know, the ABC, the Melbourne City Council and Fairfax. No, because it is saving. It's a savings measure, right?
The tax panel thought there was some need for some work as well, Judith.
And indeed, that they have basically implemented the Henry Tax Panel.
That has not
Cassandra,
been
let's just go through this. A person can only put in between $25,000 and $35,000 a year per year in the concessional contribution to superannuation. After that point, it is taxed at the marginal tax rate.
Voluntary contributions.
No.
Okay,
No, all contributions, Cassandra. All contributions, employer contributions.
I do know a little bit about the superannuation area as well.
I will bet my house on this.
And
it is $35,000, including an employer contribution.
And this, folks, is why it's so easy to get away with doing nothing, because it actually is complex, and it's only people with very good financial advisors and a lot of money who know how to really get the tax benefits out of it. And everybody else is stuck knowing you'll never get independence in your post-working life out of superannuation as it currently stands.
I'm going to turn to Tim Thornton now, and I want you to pick up John Brumby's point. Pick up on John Brumby's point, Tim.
Please.
John Brumby's made the point that spending is not the issue; it's the revenue raising that is the issue. That we need to think about the revenue base, particularly the relationship between the Commonwealth and the states. So, is that your view, that we actually do need to think about revenue rather than spending?
Yeah, I think some of the seeds for the sort of revenue shortfall at the moment sort of go back to the sort of last few budgets of the Howard Costello era at the peak of the mining boom. I think there's tax concessions that can be looked at, and because we are, relatively speaking, such a low taxing country by OECD standards, I really feel the focus should be put there.
A lot of debate has gone on to the idea that we should broaden the base of the GST and raise the rate of the GST. Internationally, in international comparisons, our consumption taxes are well below other countries. What do you think about that?
Look, I think there's a few things you'd do before you'd look at that. The GST is not really a progressive tax as such.
You mean that as a proportion of income, poor people pay more on GST than richer people?
Yeah, and I think as the Thomas Piketty book outlines, like inequality is a sort of recurrent problem. And so my leanings would be to sort of address some of the more sort of extravagant tax concessions and benefits before you'd look at the GST. I just think there's more deserving sort of things to look at before you go and look at that.
John Brumby, can I ask you about the GST? Because I think that it's an issue which has been bracketed out by governments, but we do have a fairly low rate of consumption taxes. And rich people actually spend more money than poor people, so they also do get taxed when they spend on...
Yeah. Well, I think what I've said is that... It's probably what I've said tonight. You know, if you look at government in Australia, federal government, state governments, we're not actually big spending governments. And if you look particularly at the states now with and Judith, they are big cuts, $80 billion worth of cuts to the states. The fact is the states, I don't believe, have the revenue base to pay for the sort of things that we want in community safety and health and aged care and things in the future. And I think this is just a debate Australia's got to have. And it's going to be a debate about whether we do something on the revenue side or whether you see the punitive sort of cuts that have been foreshadowed in the budget, some of which will get through the Senate, but a large proportion of them won't. So I think it's just a debate. Nobody likes talking about tax because we all pay it, and you know, if taxes go up, you pay more. But if you think of it from Victoria's perspective, we all want to spend more on health because we all want to live longer and better lives and healthier lives. We've also got an ageing population. So as the Grattan Institute has pointed out, that rate of growth of health spending is quite sharp. And then you look at congestion. Governments, whatever their political flavour, are going to be spending more on infrastructure, and that has a cost to the budget as well. You know, you've got to service the debt, you've got to maintain it, you've got depreciation. And when you look at those two things, as I call the twin pincers, I don't see any alternative in the future except something on the revenue side. And by the way, yesterday I was in Canberra speaking at CEDA, Committee for Economic Development of Australia, presentation by PricewaterhouseCoopers there. They showed a graph post the federal budget, what will happen to the combined state government deficits around Australia over the next 20 years. And it's an ugly picture. It really is. It's awful. Like, the combined deficits are hundreds of billions of dollars. So you can either take the big cuts to health and education and public transport or community safety, or we can look on the revenue side. And I say that as a treasurer. I don't think, in Victoria we were ever regarded as a big spending government, so I don't take that debate lightly. I don't think, though, there's any alternative to a discussion about that. And when you look at all of the taxes there on the horizon, the simplest, cleanest, most efficient is to look at the GST, for which all of the proceeds flow through to the states. So, you know, I know that's not an easy debate, but, you know, I've put it out there.
Judith Sloan?
Well, the states, of course, could help themselves. But the states don't want to bear the opprobrium of actually increasing their own taxes, which they then spend. And you actually have a number of efficient tax bases at your disposal. You could, for example, reform and increase payroll tax, which is the equivalent of a consumption tax. I don't see much courage, actually, by state politicians in doing that. You could impose a land tax right across the board, including on owner-occupiers.
Which would replace stamp duty and be a more efficient...
Well, it could be in addition to that, because it's actually a very efficient tax too. So up to a point, I kind of feel the states are a bit pathetic on this stuff. They're thinking, oh, well, we've got all these community expectations we have to meet, and we haven't got any money, we'll head off to Canberra. You know, stand on your own 2 feet, I say to the states, and work this one out. I mean, obviously, as an economist...
And on the GST?
You want to raise taxes in the least distorting way possible with the lowest deadweight loss, and the GST does fit that one. But the thing is, until you figure out, and I think your report on the distribution of the GST kind of went a little bit of the way there, until you figure that one out, I don't see why Victorians want to pay a higher GST just so we can subsidise our laggard cousins in Tasmania and South Australia. So until you figure out the distributional aspect, I do think that there's a really serious impediment to increasing the GST. And that's before taking into account that you would have to use some of the additional GST revenue you raise in a redistributional sense. I think you just would have to. You know,
because you'd have to compensate lower income earners.
People kind of forget, when they first introduced the GST, it was not about revenue raising. Actually, it was about changing the mix of taxes, and all the revenue was spent in terms of getting rid of very inefficient taxes and also creating some compensation for people down the low end. If you want to just raise additional revenue, it's actually a different debate.
Sandra Golding?
Oh, well. Okay, let's talk about tax. It's a very, very important debate, and we're absolutely up for it. And I think we should be building on the good work that was done by the Henry Tax Panel, which highlighted a whole range of areas where we clearly have allowed certain tax avoidance, tax expenditure arrangements to build up over time, which has been a driver of growing inequality in Australia. We're not as unequal as some other societies, but we're certainly on the wrong track. And in terms of that measure, we're one of the sort of fastest growing in terms of the gap between those who have wealth and can accumulate more and those people who, they might have got a bit of compensation first time round on the GST, but you're talking about people who are living on the $37 a day. And the last time we had a compensation package was for the carbon price. I was personally heavily involved in the work to try and get something that was genuinely adequate and fair. And I won't go into the detail tonight, but there was, of course, politics associated with it, because this is about legislation, getting it through. And the people who got the least compensation for the carbon price were the people on the unemployment payment. That's how it works. So, I've given an interview to the AFR a number of times, and every time I say, look, the GST is on the table in the debate. Last time I checked, we're all talking about it. So, of course, it will be on the table. But we need to talk about these other areas. And every time I get reported, I get talked about as if we are for reforming GST. Now, when the AFR wants to push so hard on a particular area of tax reform and not talk about family trusts, not talk about in any serious way the way negative gearing is used and is not. These are ways we're not raising revenue that we should, but as importantly, they're not providing the right triggers for the investment activity that we do need. We need investment not in existing housing stock, for example, which is where most of it goes, and crowds out people who are trying to get into the market, and we're not getting the kind of revenue that investment into new housing supply. So we are on the scale of Italy when it comes to the level of tax expenditures that we have. We have very generous tax arrangements associated for people at the high end, and the time has come for us to put them on the table and have a proper discussion about, because revenue is a big problem for us, and as importantly, we need to have the right kind of investment environment to get the sort of investment we need in terms of housing, economic activity, locked up wealth, which accumulates simply more and gets handed down.
Tim Thornton, the issue of inequality has been raised now in several points, but to what extent is inequality something we need to consider in this whole mix, do you think?
Look, I think it's a really central issue. Rising inequalities really an index of damage to the social fabric. And also in a macroeconomic sense, a growing middle class is really important to sort of maintain purchasing power in the economy. There's a lot of research that indicates that increasing inequality in society has damaging ramifications for a range of kind of social indicators related to kind of health, crime, levels of trust. Again, if the sort of Piketty book that's all the rage at the moment, he kind of makes the point that apart from those 3 decades following the Second World War, growing inequality's been the norm, and so it's really a core business for government to try to sort of stop inequality getting worse. And to try to remedy it. You know, first-year economics students, we often sort of try to inculcate them with the idea that there's a sort of equity efficiency trade-off, but I think it's
so you mean there is an argument that okay, in order to have high economic growth, you're going to have growing inequality as well. That's the trade-off we make, and you're saying that's not a trade-off we have to make?
No, I don't think it's generally there, and there's much more scope. Reducing inequality, I think, is desirable for economic growth rather than being a trade-off with economic growth.
Okay, Judith Sloan, do you agree with that reducing inequality is actually beneficial to economic growth, not a trade-off?
Well, the role of government is to protect people at the low end. I don't honestly care how much Adam Scott earns or Jerry Harvey or Buddy Franklin. Frankly, good on to them, good luck to them. As long as their high income's a result of hard work, entrepreneurship, their effort, no problem at all. And that's the kind of society we want, actually. And we then have a role of government, which is about protecting the most vulnerable, the people that Cassandra cares about, at the low end. You know, take the Abraham Lincoln view that you care for people who can't look after themselves, and I think that's exactly right. But, you know, you're actually misrepresenting the situation in Australia. The change in the Gini coefficient is insignificant. You know, we actually are a country with low levels of inequality, and we have a highly...
Can I just jump in and say the Gini coefficient is, for those who don't know, the terminology is a measure of inequalities.
It's changed hardly at all. And, I mean, it's changed more in you know, your fave like Sweden. And, I mean, I love the Piketty line, you know, what, do we have another war so we can, you know, improve inequality and destroy people's infrastructure and wealth and stuff? I don't think there's a policy implication that comes out of that.
Let me put the question to you another way, Judith Sloan. Is there a point at which inequality becomes a problem? Is there a level of inequality in a society which say, no, that's not okay, if the top 1% own 50% of the wealth?
There comes a problem when the absolute level of poverty of people at the bottom, it's too burdensome for them to bear. That's the key.
So it doesn't matter how rich people are at the top, how much people at the top earn in comparison to the bottom?
Only to the extent that if those high incomes are the result of corruption or rent-seeking from government, monopolies and the like, that's very damaging economically. So we have to be wary of those things. And of course, having a big government begets rent-seeking. That's one of the arguments against having a big government, as a matter of fact.
To the
extent that those high incomes And I mean, the interesting thing about the high incomes, and if you look at America, which is a much more unequal society, if you look at the Gini Commission, miles more, but there's tremendous amount of turnover amongst the high income earners. So, you know, basically some people will be there, you know, for a 5-year period and then not there at all. And you think about, you know, Bill Gates and Zuckerberg and stuff. I mean, they came from comfortable backgrounds, but they didn't come from super wealthy backgrounds. So let's clap for them.
This is the risk of the debate where we go to the very extremes and sort of focus on personalities, and we have our personalities in Australia too that we often refer to.
But that's why we don't care about the top 1%.
But what we care about is balance. And through from the IMF through to the OECD, and, you know, you can diss them, Judith, but they are very important. You know, they're conservative bodies. They are, you know, brought together.
No, they're not conservative.
They are conservative in the sense of they're heavily embedded in economic policy discussions. And from the G20 leaders in St. Petersburg last year, there was an explicit agreement that inequality is a global problem, and that the term of inclusive growth was adopted as an important lens through which to look at the agenda of growth. That we are not about economic growth for growth's sake, that there is, for economic reasons, if we just have a focus on the one hand at having the revenue available to be there for the people who have absolutely the least, and we don't have essentially a middle class, you know, there's some sense of balance through society. It is corrosive at a personal level, it's corrosive at a social level, it's not good for business.
But
to
we
have
do have
that
a
kind of
self-reliant
profile.
middle class. I don't know, you know...
But it's about trend,
You're
Judith.
fighting something that doesn't exist.
Which direction do we want to go? Do we want to...
Well, the trends are very good in Australia.
No, the trend is not.
That is not true, Cassandra. Look at the Gini coefficient. It has not moved.
Again.
I think we can argue about the data.
We've had 22 years of consistent growth, and we've had a decline in welfare dependency. This is a good story, particularly for the middle class. Let's celebrate
Tim Thornton.
Look, I think social mobility in the US is pretty lousy in general. It's kind of important not to look at particular individuals that may not be representative of the trend. The other thing is, I think a lot of things that we see as kind of welfare residual things might be better seen as, rather than even speak of a welfare state, speak of a social investment state, in that this is investing back in our people, and this is desirable. Yeah, I would sort of make that point.
John Brumby, I'm going to ask you about your comments on inequality.
Oh, well, I think, you know, just listening to all the comments here, there's no precise right answer on this. They're all questions of balance. But I think if you look, particularly in the United States and probably elsewhere in the developed world, you know, you've had, in the last 20, 30 years, you've had more of the, what they say, the haves and the have-nots, and you've had this new class, the have-lots. And I think the right answer is you need, you know, the right mix of people in your community to build an inclusive and harmonious community where every one of your citizens has the opportunities, and where you remove, to the greatest extent possible as a government, those levels of poverty for those lower income deciles. And by and large, Australian governments have done that. And again, I think it brings you back to this sort of contemporary debate. And, you know, I would argue that our level of government spending is not large, that what successive governments have provided up until recently in terms of cash outlays are not excessive. To the extent that there is any overspending, it is probably more likely in the tax expenditure areas. I don't agree with everything Cassandra said, but I think it's more likely to be in the tax expenditure areas. But I think long term, if we don't address this issue, particularly for the states, of how they're going to pay for health in particular, some of the aged care programs, and then not squeeze out education, the people who will miss out in an environment like that are the people at the bottom. They won't be the people at the top, they'll be the people at the bottom. And so I think this debate about how we meet community expectations of a civilised, inclusive society And that's what we are in Australia. You know, we're not a third world economy. We're not the United States. We're a civilised, inclusive society, and we've got to be careful we don't lose that inclusiveness.
And is part of that inclusiveness a sense that it's not right for, say, the top 1% of Australians to have more money than the bottom 60%? I mean, is there a point at which you say, no, there is a role for government to redistribute because it's simply not right, in a sense of social justice and inclusion, to have that level of inequality?
Well, as I said, this has been a trend, particularly in the United States.
It's a trend here as well,
and a trend in Australia. And
well, Judith doesn't agree, but a lot of others do.
Your figures are the same as mine, and I think again they go to questions of an effective tax system and the way it operates and how your tax expenditures operate and so on. And it's a surprising statistic. You know, it's 1% equals 60%. Again, the key to that is to have responsible government which provides the best opportunities in education, which provides the assistance to families to help families that are in need, to get people into work, to get people into jobs, and to provide the safety net. And to ensure that if people need to go to see the doctor or the dentist, for example, or to buy pharmaceuticals, that they can afford to do that. And I'm launching a report tomorrow on Indigenous health. And you know, when you talk about wealth and wealth distribution in Australia, some of our poorest Australians are Indigenous Australians. When you look at the evidence there, and this is COAG Reform Council data and ABS data, for a significant proportion of our Indigenous population, under current arrangements, many of them don't go to see the doctor, don't go to see the dentist, something like 40% because they can't afford to, or don't pick up pharmaceuticals. And yet when you look at the improvements in health care that need to occur, the most important interventions you can make with needy communities and the Indigenous community is to make sure they get their primary care, to make sure they go to the doctor, to make sure they have that visit, to make sure they get the antibiotics for the ear infection or the eye infection if they're in remote communities. And so if you make the cost of these things too high, it's a delicate balance, right? If you make the cost of these things too high, people won't go, their health status will deteriorate, and then in turn their potential in terms of getting a job and doing well in society is diminished. You know, that's just the way it works.
Yeah, look, I think whilst this is one of the reasons we don't have, in terms of what is the right level of inequality, it's not, and that's why I do focus, I think it is important in a sense of trend here. And that's why if you were to look, and if you say, for example, if you were to use a human rights measure of what we're looking for here in terms of adequate housing, in terms of, you know, decent education, the language is there, you know, in terms of what kind of benchmark you might be looking for in terms of a decent society. It's quite clear in Australia, whilst we are nowhere near on the scale of some other countries, there are some key groups in Australian society who are not living that kind of life right now. People on the unemployment payment, single parents in a particular set of circumstances, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And that's why I think the Australian public has, by and large, and certainly we have a very deep concern about the unfairness of this budget, because there was revenue found from making cuts or increasing costs that will directly affect the people who are in the least set of circumstances right now. And if you are a couple on $179,000 each, so, you know, you effectively get off with that very little touching you at all. If you're a couple of earning over $300,000 together, in this budget, there is very little that will directly affect you. And I think that has why it's struck at the core of a deep sense of unfairness, and that we are trending in the wrong way if we leave this kind of settings in place. When, and you've heard it again tonight, we all recognise that revenue is actually the big question, and we haven't even got to tax reform.
Judith Sloan.
Well, I guess part of the trouble with this debate is that if, of course, you don't believe in the what I call the history and geography of this topic, we can only go so far. But it's absolutely untrue that the high income earners were unaffected by this budget. I mean, they've put a 2% surcharge on income tax. I mean, gosh, that is going to raise a lot of revenue for those high income earners.
And it's a temporary
Okay,
measure. No,
we'll
it's
see
not
that.
okay. It's not okay, Judith.
But
It
they've
is
increased the
temporary.
Medicare levy again.
And it fails to address the various ways in which
you're
people
impossible
are
to
able
please,
to
Cassandra.
minimise their income through tax arrangements. And I think that was also one of the concerns about
Like,
it.
for example, the FPT exemption that applies to organisations like yours and public hospitals. It'd be nice to see something done about that, don't you think?
Okay, let's... Tim, did you want to jump in there?
It's useful to think about the attitudes behind it and sort of hear, like Joe Hockey's speech at the Sydney Institute, all of that stuff about lifting and leaning. It seems like there's a moral panic about the idea of the welfare state itself. And so when you're looking at these figures and trying to work out why these things have happened, it's useful to kind of understand the sort of ideological view of the government, which is pretty strong and in some senses is reminiscent of a kind of Thatcherite view of the welfare state.
Well, John Brumby?
I was just going to say, I think we've had a good discussion about these things, and there is, despite some of the differences, there is some agreement. And you know, there is, I think it's just completely false to make an argument that there is a welfare state in Australia. There's not, and there hasn't been under successive governments. You know, the only area in the welfare area where there is some growth is in disability pensions. And, you know, there are some issues there, and successive governments, including through initiatives like National Disability Insurance, better programs, better treatment and so on, are aiming to address that. But elsewhere, it's just not...
Age pension.
Well,
it's growing rapidly.
Yes, but that's because people get older.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. So they get older, they're going to get a pension.
In the age pension area, it's because we've had successive government policies which have, at the part pension level, made it easier and easier to access a part pension, so that right now in Australia you can access a part age pension if you own your own principal home, and it can be of any value. There's no cap on that. And you can also have up to $1 million in investment assets and be drawing down superannuation. And that's not taken into account either, and you can still be eligible for a part pension. Now, these are the areas where we could have done some decent work in looking at what is fair, what is reasonable, and should that eligibility for the pension be there, not look at flattening the indexation for people who will only ever be able to survive on the age pension.
I'm going to jump in there and let our radio audience know that everyone was nodding at that point. We have found a point of agreement on the panel. Everyone agrees that we need to look at the entitlement access point for the age pension, I think.
Well, I mean, we don't want a society that's welfare dependent. We want people to be self-reliant.
Yes, that's
don't
right.
we? Isn't that what you want?
I think we agree on that too. So let's take a question from the audience. Yes, thanks.
My name's Jeff Robinson. One of the ways that you can create and help social mobility is through education, primary, secondary, and particularly third level education. One of the things that's come out of the budget is obviously a withdrawal of a lot of funding from the third level education sector and deregulation of that, and as a result of that, substantial increases in fees associated with that. If we're looking at a smart society and an equal society, does the panel think that the proposed funding model is going to assist us to develop a smart society and to create that social equality or social mobility, or will it have a negative effect?
Okay, so the question is around the role of education funding, whether the new measures proposed in the budget will have the effect of creating the kind of social mobility that we all say we want in society, enabling people to move from different... Tim, let's start with you, Tim Thornton.
Look, I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity, particularly when you think what industries should we be trying to develop beyond the mining industry and sort of agriculture. And I think, unless it's changed in the past couple of years, I think we teach 6 or 7% of all international students across the world. Like, it's a big export industry for us. 1 in 5 students at an Australian university is a foreign student. We could kind of build on that, and I think that taking funding out of the sector is a shame. Also, I feel universities, because of the Australia Research Council's Excellence in Research Australia regime, are very obsessed with research rankings at the moment, and I think that's probably detrimental to teaching. Like, if they should assess anything, I think they should maybe start assessing the quality of teaching or the quality of graduates to kind of rebalance that. I'm unsure what deregulation will bring, but it seems a little bit of a dangerous experiment. Yeah, I just feel it's a real pity, and it has very sort of working within the university sector when the cutbacks come. Like, it's the way they kind of play through the system. It can be particularly disappointing. It's often the things, the precious things that you want to preserve are the things that often go against the wall, and actually kind of often invokes the wrong sort of response from the university sector rather than driving efficiencies. So I think it's a real pity, and education is just such an important thing for social mobility.
John Brumby?
Well, education is the key to opportunity. So, it is the single most important factor. And, all of the evidence is if you get a good start in life, if you get a good start preschool, good primary school, learn to read, write, numbers, you are likely to do well. And if you do well in school, you are likely to do well in life. And those things are pretty well unarguable. So to break the sort of patterns of inequality and to make sure that people have that opportunity, education is the key. But if you think about Australia more generally, we haven't had a discussion about this, it's sort of our place in the world, and you think of the things we do well, the assets we've got, we're never going to compete, particularly in the world today, on labour costs. We're just not. We're a developed country. We're going to have to compete on this. We're going to have to compete on human capital and our ingenuity and our intelligence and our school achievement. So investing in education is a good thing to do in terms of the social outcomes, but I think it's a good thing to do in terms of the economic outcomes. And, what we've seen at a federal level is the reductions to the states, which will affect schools. They will affect schools in the medium term. There is absolutely no doubt about that. And we've seen at the university sector the combined changes to HECS and deregulation, which, as the universities have been pointing out, and I think most famously the leaked memorandum that Glyn Davis put out to all staff at the University of Melbourne, which shows that the impact of those changes will be huge for some students. And most concerning to me, who's always been a great believer in innovation and science and technology and really being the way forward for Australia, is if you're a science student, and you're at Melbourne University, your HECS fees will go up to more than $75,000. And if you then apply the long-term bond rate, that person, if they earn an average researcher's salary through their life, will never, ever repay the debt. And you've got to ask, is that really where we want to be? When we're struggling to compete in terms of maths, we're struggling to compete in terms of science, where last year in China, 30% of their 7 million university graduates were science and engineering. Where's Australia going to be in that mix? So, I've never been in the magic pudding camp where you can just spend and spend and spend. So governments do need to balance and they do need to make priorities. So government is always difficult and challenging. But it is the wrong thing for our medium and long term to be making savings in this education area, because it's the wrong thing economically and it's the wrong thing in terms of the sort of society that I think we'd all like to see in the future.
Judith Sloan?
Well, just let's look at the facts. If we think about federal government spending on schools, next financial year will go up by 9%, the year after that it will go up by another 9%, the year after that it will go up by another 9%, and the year after that it will go up by 6%, right? We are going to have a very nice little experiment to see whether that huge increase in spending on school education actually lifts performance. Let's hope it's evaluated coming up, and I know your organisation has now... gone defunct, it could have been you, evaluate whether we actually do see improvements in relative performance with all that money slushing around, because the evidence is not good on this, as a matter of fact. When it comes to universities, we know that basically the returns are essentially private as opposed to public or social. So I think there was a very strong case, and the University of Melbourne itself, of course, was advocating fee deregulation.
So can I just jump in there, Judith, because you make a very big statement there. You say the gains from university education are essentially private rather than public. Well, now, that doesn't make sense to me. If I get a university education, I'll get a better job and I'll make personal benefits, no doubt about it. I'll also pay more tax, and I'll also presumably contribute to greater productivity and efficiency in the economy because I'm better skilled.
And for those people who haven't gone to the university and who earn higher incomes, they also pay more tax. You know, so it's actually, that's the kind of myth about that. But let's go back to the point here.
So it doesn't matter whether we have people in higher education. Socially, for the social good, it doesn't really matter. It's all a private matter.
It will continue to be highly subsidised, as a matter of fact. The tuition fees are being reduced, but they're not in any sense being eliminated. And there are some really kind of interesting... I mean, I wouldn't have introduced this with the budget, frankly, because there's so much noise in the budget. I would have taken this out, and I think I probably would have had fewer moving parts. I think you could have done some of these changes over time. But don't forget, a fifth of the additional revenue associated with the higher fees that the universities are going to charge, and not all of them will, I might add, are being allocated to equity scholarships. We don't have that arrangement at the moment. So I think there are some nice little safeguards in the system. Basically, we need a system. The previous system was completely unsustainable. I mean, there was absolutely no way it was going to work, and any government, be it Labor or Coalition, was going to tire of that arrangement. So what we need to do now is to monitor what happens. We saw in England where they increased fees quite significantly. There was a sort of short-run impact, but now it all seems to have settled down, and in fact the participation of those from the lower socioeconomic groups has actually increased relative to the other group. Arguably the other group couldn't have gone any higher, but so I think we don't need to be too fearful.
We'll probably move off this topic, but I just want to throw something on the table here. I went to my school reunion a little while ago, and I challenge anybody here tonight to not reflect on how important those early years are for shaping who you are as a person. And I think if you took the photograph of looking at the extent to which we have diversity of conditions and resources and availability from primary through secondary and through to tertiary education, we're nowhere near at the extremes. It's again of sort of recognising that actually some of that sense of where people from a whole lot of walks of life actually came together with a shared experience very early on in life of learning, and how important that is for our social cohesion over a lifetime. And the more and more we set up these serious divides between those who come from low socioeconomic circumstances through those who have very elite experiences, I think we all lose from having a future that looks like that, because everybody gains from that experience of diversity. And I went to one of those kind of schools where kids came from all over.
I'm going to take another question from the audience.
Rod Duncan from Deakin University. A lot of the discussion here is really on the, as you called it, shopping list, the basics, the education, health, infrastructure, etc. I'm concerned that there's an issue that doesn't seem to be on the table, perhaps in the table of government or public debate, and that's the imminent changes that seem to be occurring both on a global level and a national level, with things like climate change, peak oil. Domestically, we have rapidly growing cities which are not typical of advanced Western cities. There seems to be a role for retrofitting our cities. There's a real risk that the car dependency that we have structured into our cities there needs to be a retrofitting and an adaptation happening. There's a resource requirement that doesn't seem to be on the list.
All right,
that's the future.
I think the question here is really that we have big environmental issues to tackle, be they urban congestion or be it climate change and the amount of greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere and Australia's contribution to that. And the question is this, I suppose, is this somewhere where government has a big role or is it a private sector role? Tim Thornton?
Look, yeah, I think it's government will have to kind of step up, as will business, as will the broader society. But certainly, I guess the key thing, part of what we've got to do is not just to do with domestic politics. We've got to punch above our weight, not as an international wrecker of initiatives to get this problem under control, but as a builder. In some ways, the most disturbing thing that the government's doing at the moment is not so much domestically, it's the fact that it's kind of undermining the push by the US and others to really build momentum on this. In some ways, that the problem of climate change and actions like that almost dwarf everything that we're talking about today, because unless we get those things right, the costs of runaway climate change are just catastrophic.
My name's Connor. I've got a question for Ms. Judith Sloan. You're a champion of privatisation of a lot of government services, and at the start of the debate you mentioned that in an ideal world government would provide a very, very small number of services, particularly with defence and law and order. But a lot of Australians depend on government for spending which can and will not be profitable. So social spending for unemployment benefits, for public housing. How would you reconcile that issue in which government spending in areas will never be profitable? How would you, in this hypothetical world, encourage business to invest in areas where they will not make money to replace those government expenditures?
Well, I think that's a good question, but I think it's really important to make a distinction between funding and providing. I think Australian governments, including state governments, and actually, factually, it's not true because, for example, the electricity system in South Australia was entirely private until the Playford government nationalised it, but there we go. It can emerge, and it was crowded out by the public sector. But so if you think about housing, it's a more efficient thing to do is to fund the gap, help people who find affordable housing difficult to achieve, than actually building those hideous Housing Commission flats. And if you look at the work, for example, of Bob Gregory, you'll find a tremendous amount of social disadvantage clustered, geographically clustered around public housing estates. So I think we've moved on from that, and I think there's actually a lot more scope to, instead of having a sort of standing army of public servants providing all these services, to think actually much more laterally in how you go about this. I mean, I don't know where you would have sat on this in Victoria, but when I went to the Victorian budget lock-up, which was hell, I might add, but, they're building 7 new schools, which need to be done because of growing population. They're basically getting the private sector to do that. They'll be leased back to the states, and the private sector will be responsible for the building and the maintenance, which strikes me as a good idea, because do you really want the principal dealing with the blocked toilets and the need for repainting and the like? So, that's, I think, a really useful discussion to have, and that's why I think the sort of size of government percentage stuff is a bit sterile, compared with sort of thinking outside the box and thinking with some of these. And, you might think Cassandra and I don't like each other. Well, I like you. She possibly doesn't like me. But, I think it is, I'm kind of quite attracted to this idea of social bonds. One of my friends, and quite a libertarian friend, is involved, for example, in creating social bonds to fund people in Cambodia to undertake higher education. Anyone want to invest, come and see me. For $2,000 or $3,000, you can get someone in Cambodia to go to university. The return is huge. And the social bond holders will also benefit.
I think the area of housing is one where we need some seriously smart, sophisticated thinking about partnership arrangements over getting the kind of investment we need and diversifying the kind of housing models that we have. Australia's very struck in this hard dichotomy between used to be, you know, public housing and private housing, and now we've got you're a renter or you're a homeowner, and this high level of anxiety, quite understandable, for people who never feel that they'll get home ownership. And what that delivers, of course, there's the wealth accumulation part of it, but actually fundamentally it's about that sense of security that you get, that you can't be moved on. That's what is the aspiration that drives so many people to try and buy your home. Now, we're going to have to think differently about the different ways in which we can finance, the way we can good use of land that delivers on an environmental outcome, but also delivers on one of our biggest future challenges, which will be loneliness. You know, how many people have been involved in those discussions where people try and explore the way they can get future housing together in a way that's different and collective and affordable. Now that's where we could do some really exciting work, and when we don't quite have the right signals from government at the moment on that front.
John Brumby, you want to jump in?
I was just going to make a point in terms of the question that I think...
do you agree with me too?
Well, no, I don't think your answer related to the question, and I say that. No, and I just say that because I think the question was really about services which are intrinsically unprofitable. And so if you take the public transport system in Melbourne, for example, you know, nobody likes paying the fare and things like that, but the fare box only returns 40% of the cost of operating it. If you use the country rail lines, you know, you go to Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong or Latrobe Valley, the fare box returns about 30 cents in the dollar. So, you know, and you think of police, what are you going to do in the future in terms of police? Well, I think the state needs to employ police. You know, we don't want private police just, you know, in the local neighbourhood and things like that. So I think when it gets back to this basic discussion, when you go through what we spend money on as a government in Australia, basically we're pretty sensible. And basically successive governments have been pretty sensible about finding a reasonable and balanced way forward. And we're not, you know, this giant big spending monolith, and we don't need to make revolutionary changes. And there will always be services which are intrinsically unprofitable to provide. And public transport is a good one. You could put the fares up by, what, 120% tomorrow, if my math's right, or something from 40% to 100%. You could more than double the fares, that's what you'd be doing, more than doubling the fares, in fact, 2.5 times, and you'd recover that.
But you've got private providers actually
but that's a
providing
separate,
the service.
No, but that's a separate. No, that's a separate question. And your point about the schools is a separate thing. Whether you do a school, and we did schools under PPP. Hang on. No. We did schools under PPP. You've still got to pay for them as a government. Okay. So it's just about the system of provision. You can do it the old public works way, you know, and get the old public works department to build them and you pay for it, or you can do it as a PPP and you pay for it and the maintenance charge is all bundled up, but you've still got to pay for it. And if you do a hospital with a PPP, you've still got to pay for it. So this argument about you can strip away government to the bare basics, I don't think that's right. You know, you're still going to need a defence force, you're still going to need a social security system, you're still going to need Medicare, you're still going to need police, you're still going to need a public transport system, you're still going to need a public education system, because not everybody can afford to send their kids to the best private schools. So there's not too many ways in which you can realistically reduce the size of government in Australia, and you wouldn't want to do that anyway because our government is not too large under any assessment.
We're going to have to make that the final word because we've run out of time. Thank you to our event partners, the City of Melbourne, City of Melbourne's Knowledge Program, Melbourne Conversations, Federation Square, Future Leaders and the Big Ideas program at ABC Radio National. Thank you to our audience and thank you for your contributions from the audience, and thank you above all to our panellists, the Honourable John Brumby, Professor Judith Sloan, Cassandra Goldie and Tim Thornton. Thank you all very much.